Yeah, so you asked when I started. My first job was in Mississippi
Yeah.
in 1967. And then I went, in '68, I moved from Mississippi to Fresno, California in
Yeah.
1968. Started teaching there in the fall of '68. But it's 22 when I was in Mississippi and then 23 in Fresno. So I started that, I went to Mississippi right after graduate school, the Rochester Institute of Technology. So it was a school of art, and it was pretty typical graduate program. You were given a studio, and you worked in the classes with pretty much critiques. You took classes in Western civilization and theory and history. Because the model at the time, you go into graduate school, you were given a studio space to work, and you worked in there. And and in this space, the person who was studying under would walk through and occasionally visit and talk to you about what you're doing, forming this idea of what it meant to be an artist. Because I think that what that meant came late to me. It was at some point when I was undergraduate school. I began to understand what that meant, and then I thought that it was very important then to go to an art school. I would say that in those years, what was being formed in my mind is simply helping form an identification of myself as an artist. As a kid in school, I went to Saturday arts classes, and I went to an art high school, and I was often told that I should be an artist, and I suppose I didn't really know what that meant, but I was often told this, so I didn't really think much about it until I was getting close to graduating. It was a couple of years from graduating from graduate school. So the first idea that I had about being an artist is that you have to go to graduate school. I met a curator from the Guggenheim who was there for a semester taking class in the photography school out there. And he came by my studio, looked at work, and so he lived in New York, and I lived in New Jersey, but it goes just across the river from New York. Whenever there was something going on, he would let me know and invite me to attend and participate. And this way, I met the major figures, Warhol and Rauschenberg and Johns, and I often went to the Velvet Underground. From this, it began to help me form the idea of a professional artist. And then, as I said, there were no models. I was not interested in the kinds of practices that were going on around me, because this is at a time that most people who went to graduate school was heavily influenced by abstract expressionism or expressionism in general. Conceptual art was in its nascent stage, and also the new art, which is the John Stein and Rauschenberg, was the radical avant-garde at the time, and I wasn't interested in that. Because the other problem is that what to do after graduate school, and I didn't even think about that either. So I didn't apply to any schools while everybody else was furiously applying to schools to teach. I didn't, and then at the last minute, it occurred to me that I have to do something, or I was going to get drafted into the war. And this friend who was a teacher in Mississippi said, why don't you come teach there? And so I took him up and I went down there and teach. It was horrible. Yeah, it was completely horrible. It was at a time when lynchings were still going on. And Martin Luther King was shot the year that I was in Mississippi. And so there was a lot of demonstrations going on, and students at the school I was in participated in these demonstrations. The state brought down the state police and essentially broke up demonstrations by shooting at my students. And so several of my students got shot. And at that point, a few days later, after I found out that 3 students in my class got shot, I went to the dean and I resigned. And he asked me, why do you want to leave? I mean, everything you had to draw on every power I had to stop from breaking down in complete laughter. It's such a question. I mean, this place is crazy. That's why I want to leave. So, and it was risky because the war was still going on, and I didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War. But I'd rather take my chances with the war than to stay in Mississippi. But then I was lucky. I got a job, in Fresno. Essentially, there was a book on Tantric Buddhist art that I could identify with the most in terms of a kind of, not only in terms of a form of representation and the types of images that I was interested in, but an attitude about art itself. Because one of the big things that I had trouble with in terms of finding a connection with the people who were working around me in graduate school is that I couldn't understand how they could find pleasure in exploring their subjectivities. The condition of that value was lost on me. That is to say that, to me, in expression, people valued expression for its own sake, not from what one can learn from using that as a part of a communication system. So it became the very definition of artistic practice itself. That when you make art, you use art language to express yourself, and that's it. But the question of its communication was something that wasn't how to work in the communicative process. And pretty much that was because the thing that kept people from doing that is because they were being given. This was all being done within the context of aesthetics. The aesthetics itself that kept you from being unconcerned about the process of communication. We sat around and looked at paintings and commented on them, and people were saying, I like this and I like that, and this is an interesting idea.
Yeah.
And I couldn't figure out on what basis they could make these decisions. It just was over, or how they're grounded. Outside of a set of conventions that, this is something that I've conventionally come to value, and I see it now, and therefore I value it. And I thought that was regressive if they were valued based upon simply a set of conventions. And then said, well, but outside of these conventions, it doesn't mean that, I have to sort of absorb or accept a set of conventions in order for me to find value in the expressive act. Which seemed to be a contradiction to the whole idea of expressivity, where it is this kind of sort of uniquely isolated experience, or at least coming from that anyway. So when I got the book on Tantric art, and I've noticed that all of these drawings of the cosmos that the Tantric monks were making, images that they got from their practice, the yoga practice, meditation. I made note that they didn't. There was no belief or any idea of a notion of the unconscious. So there's no idea of a location for an expressive act, as we have in the West. And I said, well, to me it was like amazing, because it's a thing that, totally my whole idea that art was a function of a particular psychological act of expression. And here I was watching a whole culture, not even knowing about this idea, and having an entirely different paradigm for the process of mark making. That is that making objects that are made for the purpose of interpretation, that are entirely different paradigm, that have nothing to express anything. They say, well, you have a culture that's older than Western culture, and not even, instead of considering the unconscious, so there's no expression, and nevertheless they can make art. So I said, well, I can make art without using my expressivity. And realizing that was the thing that was holding me back, that I could, this idea of art as expressivity was this wall, this barrier for me, and for my finding something that made art sort of a meaningful thing to me. In general, it was a period of time where experimentation in education as well. I mean, in art, the avant-garde was going strong, and the politics were fierce. The idea of radical politics was fierce. Universities were a whole lot more experimental and trying to be more experimental in the way that they dealt with the production and the dissemination of knowledge. People to teach, invent courses, teach what they want. And then also, as you said, this is at the same time, because when I was teaching in Fresno, I started in '68, but by '71, it became an interesting school for New Yorkers, because we started a visiting artist program, and we had just about everybody from New York. I didn't very much like living in Fresno, but I actually enjoyed very much teaching at the university, because it was a really kind of an interesting place, an interesting artist. They had an extraordinary English department with internationally known poets, and the English department was full of political radicals that were constantly giving the administration in trouble. It was the beginning of this attempt to diversify the student population. Generally, they came looking for alternatives, because the beatnik generation just ended, and the hippie generation was like going strong. Everybody was smoking dope, and students were they were a little older, and they were a lot wiser in terms of what's going on in the world than today. Well, they did not come with the expectation of a technical training, although you could get it there. But they came with this sort of a more open-ended idea about what could possibly be an art education. Without the opportunity to teach what I wanted, I used class to help me try to figure out what I wanted to do as an artist. And so the one thing that and that's why I really invented content and form. So it was sort of an experimental seminar. And the one thing that I did discover from reading Falcion and then later George Kubler, and then, but also my interest in non-Western art, with this, at the time like Asian art and tantric art, was that I was really not interested in perpetuating expressionist practices. So for me, I got more joy trying to use art to think critically. So it's completely selfish positioning here, of trying to figure out how to make an art that itself became a vehicle for critical thought and art at the same time. And so content form, using these texts as a framework, content form became sort of an open-ended seminar by which we tried to find the relationship of forms and ideas, experimenting with the various ways that these things can relate to each other. And so what I did was that I would give them these readings, and then we talk about them and give them assignments, and the assignments had the intention of focusing on the relationship of representation, the relationship of what forms might mean in any particular social situation or context, or how you can bring meaning to forms using the art process, and experimenting with all of that. And one of the major features is that there's a lot of rationalist or logical thinking strategies being used. Systems became a great vehicle, because it kept you away from dealing with issues of expressionism. I continued over the years to introduce the newest critical thinking. What I was using was about as much as is existing, except for these books on art theory, like Roger Fry and people like that, which really are books on aesthetics, and they're calling it art theory. Beginnings of that, of course, happened with people like Douglas Crimp and those postmodern writings around the pictures generation. But what was also interesting is that those sort of critical texts started developing literature. Through that, I picked up on the structuralists and the post-structuralists. And typically, I had the slightest idea of what they were talking about. And so I would throw it in and I tell students, like, here's this Roland Barthes text, let's read it. And then I say, yeah, okay. And then afterwards, okay, let's just form an idea that could be about the basis of a work of art. Let's try to figure that out. And I say, okay. And because of the difficulty of text, the convention is that it employs too much of the intellect, and therefore it has nothing to do with artistic practice. So the biggest struggle is to convince students that the difficulty of the text shouldn't dissuade them, that it is something that is unavoidable, but something that is necessary, so that we could develop a kind of critical language and to connect to certain formal processes that can result in the production of works of art. With Saul DeWitt, who had come to in the mid-70s, he began to champion my work and became friends. He was not a mentor. He was, that it was a kind of parallel activity, being done by people who were well known, and I wasn't, but it was not something that influenced me at all. And even then, I knew that the nature of my interest in conceptual practices was different from theirs. It wasn't the same thing. But that was the closest thing that was going on around me at the time. So I was very interested in representation. I continued to have an interest in the poetics of representation. I had this conviction that I believed the poetics of representation had little to do with the psychology of the expressive. And most criticality at the time sort of merged those two things together. So as I, the anti-studio practice, post-studio, was a radical critique of the tradition of painting, or even sculpture, but a radical critique of the necessity of the studio. Sort of the documentarian style, sort of experimentalism of artists like Doug Hubler and so forth, and Michael. Thought that the only way that you can maintain the radicalism in the avant-garde is to resist the studio, and so I wasn't so much against the studio, except that I had a great appreciation for certain sort of forming paradigms that if you're in a building where there's canvases and paint, then you're going to paint, right? So I understand that, but I wasn't interested in so much in critiquing these formal ways that art is produced. What I was interested in something I thought was sort of a little bit more at the core, and that is the very means that we form ideas itself. And so this is why I was very interested in representation, and this is what I thought was not going on, And when it was, like for example, you can say that when you look at the work of Al Ruppersberg and people like that you can say, well, Al is very much involved in representation, or Terry Allen. They are, to the degree that they're interested in the sort of the mechanism of narrative. What was different from my interest is that there wasn't an interest in sort of deconstructing the very means of narrative itself, the very core of narrative itself. So so that's where I was going. I had to stay within the realm of representation.
Yeah.
That's pretty much where I got interested. That was my particular interest in semiotics, and when I started dealing with that. So I noticed that for me to cause a jolt in the stability of the world that I see. Where I could find the most common place I could find that is through reading. Reading the ideas of others, because I think that they can take me further than I can take myself. And so reading was a way of destabilizing the known paradigms. The value is not that it tells you where to go. The value is that it takes you off of a set of conventions. The purpose that reading served in my classes, to try to form a critical language in order to articulate certain concepts, standing concepts and experiences, so that your relationship, you can find a relationship that is destabilized. Well, it's interesting that you would think of like chaos as the alternative, If in fact I'm moving off of the center, that I would necessarily be in this indeterminate space. There's no reason to think that. Well, this is why Cal Arts is perfect, because it's a perfect place for a person like me who regards the classroom as an extension of the studio, where students are part of involved in part of the process of figuring out stuff, and so in that regard, my teaching hasn't changed. I'm still and always trying to be a provocateur in the classroom, as I'm sure you know. But what I do with this content is informed by not only the growth of my own ideas, but also what happens around me in the world, and it happens in art and so forth. And so the critical language, the positioning, like I said, in the 70s, there was no semiotics with respect to artistic practice, but in the 80s I was teaching semiotics because it was there, but it served a similar role as the Falcyon did in 1969. Echo in 1979 served a similar function as Falcyon in 1969, except that it became a part of living in the contemporary world. That you want to deal with these things through ideas and experiences that are somewhat on the edge. It's the best example of the relationship to my practice and teaching. What the content informed the class, how I was able to use that class to help push these ideas that I had about cognitive processes. The libraries where in the bookstore you got books and you read. So information did not travel at a fast pace in those days, and so now if you want to get information, you can do it just like that. But in those days, it'd take a couple of days. You'd have to go to the library. It happens less at Cal Arts than in a lot of places because at Cal Arts, there's less suspicious. They're less suspicious about critical, intellectual critical thought. But for general, what happens is like there's a lot, and for a lot of people, it's really a good thing to happen. But there's a lot of looking and staring, and this makes me think of there's a possibility that and I can associate that, and so this is what I think about. I'll see you next week, and like that's the critique. So that is a substitute of what used to happen, 100 years ago, which was, a more direct technical discussion about how to get sort of metaphoric effects. The critique was, what poetic effects are you getting with these techniques? And because the end was to get to these poetic effects. but there was a very linked relationship. Like I said, there were two ways that we were trying to push envelopes, because since the avant-garde was still sort of alive at that time. And one is through, picking up in usual forms of representation, known as the post-studio, using language photography and so forth. And the other was sort of trying to explore this idea of radicalizing experiences. And so what happens is that you wind up doing performances that, because the framework that you worked with had the potential to get you in trouble. So this one performance. There are a couple. One was that we were going to do a march, a picket. We were going to make these signs and picket, and this really is about considering the issue of the real issue of context, the relationship, how a certain situation or context will inform a reading of something, even if it produces it as even if the reading is blatantly and clearly wrong. It would produce that. So we made these signs and we wrote short excerpts from Heidegger on it. And so we started picketing in front of the library on the campus, and we didn't expect it, but a whole bunch of people irate at us started coming at us, and they were really belligerent to the degree that they started yelling and calling us names and telling us that they're going to hurt us, and we would say, don't you read our signs? and like there's a Sein und Dasein is a sign, right? And like this doesn't say down with the Republicans. This is Sein Dasein, and it meant nothing to them, right? And they were livid, and so we literally had to pack up and run away because we were just about people were just so tired of demonstrations and liberal the liberal onslaught that just that mere form, no matter what, they couldn't see past it. The 60s and 70s is an extraordinarily interesting time because what you had on one hand, you had a kind of culture where sort of remarkable traditions and rules and laws existed, like women's. There's still places in the country where all kinds of impediments are put up in front of women to even vote, and so women. There wasn't this total freedom for women to vote. There wasn't this total freedom for minorities to vote. There were curfews for black people. I mean, there's this like insane war going on where you're watching your friends dying left and right. And at the same time, you had a really radical and a really progressive and really sort of imaginative sort of young population. It was remarkable. And because of that, the universities benefited immensely by that population of people. And it was responsible for a very rigorous period of artistic production. Well, I mean, I think that there's streams of thought that are better today than they were in the past. And so as a generalization, I would say the culture today is more conservative, American culture. But there's streams. You can only be a generalization because there's streams that are way better today than
Sure.
Than it would be a much better position in the past. And like for example, issues of it's still a struggle, but issues of the liberation of women and minorities, diversity, the whole postmodern project it made it possible inclusions that were not possible. Pluralism and diversity became something that began to have agency by the middle 80s, and where there was no such agency earlier. So I see that as better, but to have that as a symbolic marker of the difference between then and now, it can't be because of the complexity.